Welcome to the Lake Forest Podcast, a podcast about the lovely city of Lake Forest, featuring topics like local news, sports, music, people, and food. My name is Pete, and I also live in Lake Forest. We have a sponsor for the show, Neuro Noodle. Get a doodle of your noodle. Now that we're starting to get back into live sports, your kids get a physical, right? Well, they should also get a brain map too, so they have a baseline to compare it to in case something happens. Let's get your kids back on the field. Visit neuronoodle.com. Okay, one of the goals of the podcast is educate our listeners on Lake Forest, and who better to educate us on Lake Forest history than the Arthur Miller, author of Lake Forest Estates, People, and Culture, co-author, as you said, Arthur. Let's chat with Arthur and see what he has in store for us today. Arthur, welcome back on the show. A long time no see.
Yes, thank you very much. Happy to be here. And thank you for the great introduction. I'm historic myself, so I mostly represent a lot of Lake Forest history just by being here for a half a century. So happy to
50
share
plus
it.
years, yep.
Yeah, happy to share
Well,
it.
well, Arthur, we had you on Friday talking about the library plans, and I
Sure.
was so caught up in the show. I'm looking over at this book on my coffee table. I'm like, wait a minute, that's the guy who was just on the show, Arthur Miller. Wait a minute, we got to get into this a little bit more. Arthur, how long have you been doing history? You were at the Lake Forest College. Please give it a little bit more background. We didn't do you justice on the last show.
Well, okay. So I've been in Lake Forest for about a half a century. I retired in 2013 from being the archivist and the librarian for special collections at Lake Forest College. Um, Worked with a lot of students and faculty to help them use historical materials, primary sources, to investigate and learn research methods, and did that. And along in the process, I did lots of exploring of local history, because in the 70s and 80s, especially, the first generation of the builders of the really nice David Adler houses, Howard Van Doren Shaw houses, and all, they were passing away, or they were moving into retirement homes, like I've just done. And so I would go over to look through the books, or if they weren't as timely, I would go over right after the undertaker to look at the books, and got to see through the kinds of things that they had. And in these big old houses that are all over town, they would put stuff in the attic, and they, for generations, might not pull it out, you know. So I remember going into one house where there was stuff with a big ribbon tied around it. It was there's things that they had collected, their souvenirs from the 1893 World's Fair, still up there, just like they'd put them in there in 1893, the fall. So, I mean, you see things like that. There were little time capsules all over the town. And a lot of those books worked their way into Lake Forest College Library, and people are still using them, coming in to use them. So that was how I got to know the town, was seeing all these places, seeing all the way people had built up their collections and all.
No, where are you originally from?
I'm from the other side of the lake, from the Michigan side,
Okay,
and
got it.
came to Chicago for grad school, and have stayed all along the shoreline, downtown Chicago, near North Side, Hyde Park, Evanston, Lake Forest. I now live at Lake Forest Place, a retirement home. It's the farthest from the lake I've lived in over a half century. So.
Oh, it's we're trying to get somebody from Lake Forest Place to come on. That's another hidden gem over there.
Yeah, a
Real
lot
nice
of people with
place.
a lot of knowledge and everything about about the town. Sure, lots of hands
Okay.
on the elephant.
Now that book that's on my coffee table. Who did you write that with, and how did that come about? Just going through attics and whatnot, putting things together. How did it start? How'd you get the idea to do it?
Well, as I say, I was working in the college's Lake Forest College archives, so I did a lot of things with other people. Um, you kind of, you've probably read Tom Sawyer, where he
Yeah.
paints the white fence. And
Yeah.
he would paint just enough fence to get other people interested, and they would do all the work, you know. And that was that was my approach to authorship. I would prime the pump, help people get going on their books. I think the one you're talking about, Lake Forest Estates,
Yep.
People and Culture,
Right.
that one grew out of somebody who was helping us at the college. We were writing our first history of Lake Forest College, which was founded back in the 1850s, but it didn't have a really good, didn't have a published separate book history until 2000. And so Shirley McDonald Paddock from here in town helped us on that project. And we had so many pictures and we had to sort through. We couldn't, for the college history, we could only take, I think we took about 70 pictures that were just local, really. But
Yeah.
there were a whole bunch of outtakes, you know, that couldn't fit in. So we did this Lake Forest Estates, People and Culture book to suck up some of that stuff that was left over. Well, it's at a nice price point by Arcadia Publishing. It's sold over 8,000 copies over the years. It's just a little quiet. It's a good executive summary history of Lake Forest, the different aspects of it that people maybe knew, some of it they did know, some of it they didn't know, but it's also got some great pictures. A lot of them came from Shirley. She had them. A lot of them came from college archives that weren't specifically about the college.
Right.
And so it just has, it was the first history that had been out since the 1960s, kind of, and that kind of put it all into one story. And it's kind of it's not too formidable to tackle. You know, you don't have to go through footnotes.
Right.
So
we'll put a link. We'll put a link to the book in the podcast. I mean, I moved here 3 years ago, and it's one of the first things I was given when I moved in here.
Great. Super.
Seriously, it's you go through. Hey, these are cool pictures. And seriously, I'm staring at it. I'm like, oh my God, what a dope I am. So Art, I hopefully now, is it Art or Arthur? How would you like to be addressed on the show?
Anything that's not profane.
Okay. Well, I'll have to work on that, Art.
Art is good.
Okay. Art is very good. I thought it would be cool if it's all right with you, a city kid that's moved to Lake Forest that doesn't know enough about it and needs learn a little bit more. I would think if it's possible once a week to hook up with you on here, you pick the topic and we just go through it and you give us a little education and we share it with, the listeners out there. Art, what do you think?
Well, I can try to do it. And so sounds like fun. The thing is to maybe try to hook it into something that people are interested in at this time. So some of it's kind of arcane, maybe, that they wouldn't.
Yeah.
But if I can hook it to something that people are noticing, and wondering, why is that?
Like the traffic on Deerpath?
Well, there you go. See, how many of us have cooled our heels waiting in line to sneak past a big old crane or something like that?
Yeah.
Recently on Deerpath Road, and why does that make sense? I mean, why are we doing that? What's specific about that, and what can we figure out? Well, it's kind of rooted in Lake Forest geography, and it's also rooted in some of its political background too. Okay. So, what people probably don't realize is that it is one of the things that appealed to people when they first came out in the 1850s to look at the place, is that it was a very irregular terrain. It looked like, because a lot of the Presbyterians that first settled here were from either New England or Scotland, or maybe the Appalachian Mountains. They were Scots-Irish. And so they were not used to flat, swampy places like Chicago.
Yeah.
They liked up and down and irregular places. So it looked great to them from the start. So they settled on the east part of that, east of Green Bay Road. And if you think about it, you'll probably notice it when you go around town. If you live on the east side, if you live east of Green Bay Road, You're either you're right in between a ravine, between ravines on a high point, or you're in the bottom of the ravine, or along the sides of the ravine. Everything, all the water is flowing east into Lake Michigan from Green Bay Road. And sometimes, depending on where your house is, it's flowing pretty fast. And through your basement, So and it's really interesting terrain. And if you look at your lot, you can maybe see a difference of a couple of feet between the higher west side to the lower east side of your lot.
East side, right.
So that's what goes on the east side. The west side of Green Bay Road is a whole different pattern. So all that water that goes from the east side goes into Lake Michigan. It flows through the lakes to the St. Lawrence River, and it goes out into the Atlantic Ocean. On the west side of Green Bay Road, over by Deerpath School or something like that, rain falls, it lands, it goes down into the creek down by the public safety building, which is the Skokie River, or the east twig of the north branch of the Chicago River. And it flows down there into the Des Plaines River, then into the Illinois River, then into the Mississippi River, and it goes to the Gulf of Mexico. So it's interesting that what we are is Green Bay Road is the Continental Divide. It's not exactly Colorado. It's one of the narrowest little stretches around the Great Lakes where you have the Continental Divide coming right up to it. I mean, the river flows so, the edge of the water flow into the lake is so narrow that it's unusual. So we know the big deep ravines on the east, but you have an interesting pattern on the west side because it's a series of ridges or moraines made from clay and gravel left over when the glacial lake 10,000 years ago retreated as it melted, and it left these sort of sandbar-like spaces. And then in between the sandbars, the water sort of gently flows through what used to be swamps down toward the city. So all of our north-south roads sort of move along the tops of these ridges for obvious reasons, because they're clear pretty much all the year. You can get through. And the people who built the early houses in Lake Forest, the big estates, the first big estates, they weren't dumb either. They built their houses on the high ground. So if you go along Ahwahnee Road, you'll see houses up on the right side of the road. Green Bay Road, one of the very first houses like this was the original Anuencia Country Club house. It was an old house, or it was a house that was bought by the Anuencia Club. And they used it. It was a big wooden house, and they used it until they couldn't get fire insurance anymore. And then they built the present Anuencia Club that's there. But that was the first one that would look out west across the sunset, to the sunsets across these ridges. The golf course went down to the river, across the river, and that was the beginning of it. But then people went to the next ridges. They went to Ridge Road, which is out west. And there was a big house there in 1905 that was built for the King family, their farm, and then south of that, later ones. And because cars hit Lake Forest in about 1904, and so then everything moved out. As soon as there were cars, people moved out west, and then they went out to Waukegan Road, which first one house there was 1900. A smart real estate lady from Chicago bought the first estate there in 1900. And of course, it's all real estate, it's all lots and everything now,
right?
Houses. Later, it was Melody Farm that was off of there. So that was the setup. And the thing was that all these roads were built up and they had fancy houses on them. Now, the trouble started, the political trouble with all this started in about 100 years ago, 1920-21. The Pennsylvania Railroad couldn't go any farther beyond, they couldn't go beyond Chicago. They could only go to Chicago. But there was a new technical innovation that they had been noticing that was was bigger and bigger trucks. The trucks in 1915 or so were about the size of a small SUV, but they were getting bigger. And so as better motors were coming along. So they thought, well, we could run trucks up and down to Milwaukee, and we could extend our freight business up to Milwaukee and back. And so, you know, Illinois has always been amenable to business. And down in Springfield, they got a law passed that they could build truck lane, 4-lane truck routes on Sheridan Road and Green Bay Road up through the North Shore, up to Waukegan and on to Kenosha and then to Milwaukee. Well, when this announcement came out about this plan, all the people that lived on Sheridan Road and Green Bay Road, a number of them whom happened to be lawyers, thought, you know, maybe this isn't the best idea to have trucks rolling past my big fancy David Adler or any of these Howard Van Doren Shaw or lots of architects' houses. So they said, well, maybe we'll think of a way around this. So they organized. They organized in each community along the North Shore. They organized a property owners association. And then these property owner associations banded together to create the North Shore Property Owners Association. And they took on the Pennsylvania Railroad, endeavoring to tie them up in legal issues as long as they possibly could. They didn't want the trucks going. But of course, as the 20s went along, trucks kept coming and there was no place to put them. So the Republican presidents, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, they weren't as big on infrastructure, but by 1933, 34, they were getting organized about infrastructure under Franklin Delano Roosevelt to put people back to work. And they wanted to put a new road through to take care of these trucks. Well, all the good real estate for the roads had been taken by Waukegan Road, Ridge Road, and things like this. And so they didn't have a good high place to put this road. So they thought, well, we'll just put it in a creek bed.
Oops.
It was just nobody wanted it. It was just vacant land. So they did. And it was a great idea. The trouble is that they ended up with these underpasses along the way in Lake Bluff and in Lake Forest. And it wasn't a huge problem. There was a little hospital before that in 1936 or so when this road got built. The hospital was on the Lake Forest College campus. It was on the east side. And it was no trouble getting to it in any kind of conditions. They moved the hospital in 1942 west, but still it wasn't a big problem. If you had a big emergency in Lake Forest, you probably call the undertaker rather than the hospital, you know, the ambulance.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have that good techniques for emergency care. So, but as time's gone by, you know, things have gotten better and better. Also, as we noticed, they announced this about a week or so ago, rainfall is up in recent decades on the North Shore in our Chicago area. Rainfall is up. So we're dealing with more big downpour rains, and that thing gets flooded. Well, if it gets flooded and Mr. Godelot's, the CEO of XYZ Corporation, has a heart attack, he doesn't want to be cooling his heels driving down to, you know, maybe over to Wesley Road and then cross and up Waukegan. By that time, that's not good. And it just isn't a good idea. So to not have the east side cut off from the hospital, they decided they had to tackle that big problem they got there, that underpass. So even though it's inconvenient for most of us, it was a serious life safety issue for the emergency vehicles. So then they got this idea that they would dig these ponds in the golf course and pump the water over there when there's a storm. They got a big pump they're building over there just south on the southeast corner of the highway and Deerpath. and they're going to
Yeah.
move the water to the northeast corner, 2 different locations. So if you've glanced as you waited, if you've glanced into these ponds, they're deep. They're very deep ponds.
Yeah.
So if your ball goes in there and there's water in there, you don't want to go in there. First off, they're probably going to stock it with little babies from the Loch Ness monster. It's so deep that you don't know what'll happen once you get in that water. There could be a huge
Yeah.
pike that's going to grab you. Who knows? But it would be too deep to go down in there. So we're going to have these big ponds, and then we'll call them water features. Let's do that.
Yes. Yes.
Sounds
yes,
more
yes.
elegant, doesn't it? Sounds more
Yes,
Lake
it does.
Forest. We'll call them
Right.
water features. And so the water will get pumped in there. Other times it'll be kind of dry. And we're solving a problem. But all of us, when we're waiting there, it doesn't make much sense. We know they're fixing the underpass, but the question would be, well, is the cure worse than the disease?
Right.
Not really, because it's a life safety issue that they're doing it for. Not because I'm inconvenienced because I can't get across, or I have to go around it. So it all has to do with Lake Forest geography, and which is pretty unusual. You think, okay, it's just Lake Forest. What's interesting here? It's not the Rockies, it's not the North Desert, it's not the Atlantic Ocean, but we've got Lake Michigan, which is pretty high these days. We got bluffs. We've got these deep ravines that were created probably when the lake receded. That lake receded way back 10,000 years ago, and is continuing to erode. And then we've got these wonderful ridges and rivulets going down toward the city. So it makes an interesting geography. And if you notice it when you're driving around, it makes it more fun.
Never thought about it. I did hear that it took 10 years to make it happen. Is that true? Was there a lot of politics involved? If it's like a life or death issue, I would think politics would take a back seat to that. No?
Well, I'm sure that, yes, I think that is. I don't know all the details of the politics.
Yeah,
but
right.
Everything takes a lot of time. Everything gets reviewed by several different agencies. We've got a city agency, we've got a county agency, we've got a state IDOT department, we got feds, in Washington, D.C. And I think, that's one of the problems that they talk about with all the bureaucracy, that, it takes a long time to get anything accomplished. And then you have to work it into the budget cycle. And there's probably a lot of people down in Springfield that think, gee, now how many people are voting Democratic in Lake Forest? Let me count. 1, 2.
Right. They're taking account, yeah.
You have to have a little clout and you have to work it, But we're in an infrastructure cycle, and this is good jobs, creating this work. And it is going to solve a big problem that needs to be solved for East Lake Forest to be able to get emergency care to the hospital.
Are there any other overpass issues in Lake Forest besides Deerpath and 41 there?
Well, see, one of the problems is we have a railroad crossing issue.
Oh,
we don't have so many. We need more underpasses or overpasses because we got railroad issues. If you go along, if you follow the 41, it goes under tracks, at one point.
Right.
Kind of does a little jog there.
Yeah.
That's between the 2 ridges at Awani Lane and at Ridge Road. That's where there's a little gap in the kind of sandbars. And so there's a place where it does it. But otherwise, if you are going across town, you can run into freight trains, and they're longer and longer. And that's not new. I mean, Lake Forest was founded by the railroad. I mean, there wouldn't have been any Lake Forest here if there hadn't been the railroad go through in 1855.
Yeah.
So people are upset that we got trains, but this is Chicago. That's what we got.
Right. You don't have the trains, you don't have Lake Forest. I mean,
Well, you wouldn't have you wouldn't have not only that, but you wouldn't have the economic engine of all that freight passing through
Right.
Chicago, which is creates a whole lot of jobs for people.
Art, this is awesome. Think we'd do this every week, Art? What do you think?
Well, we got to think of more topics and more things that that link, something to, so it isn't just kind of out of the blue, but it makes sense. And everybody's sitting on Deerpath wondering
Yeah,
what's
what's going on?
what's going on, and so it's a question, and so we'll look for more questions. So
You know what, Art? People don't know what they like till you present it to them, sometimes. So
okay, all right,
if you think
all
it's
right,
interesting, I'll be here and we'll get a couple listeners. Don't worry about it.
okay,
Art,
good,
we'll see you again next week. We're proud to have you as part of this show. This is awesome.
great. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
All
Super.
right. Thanks for listening to the Lake Forest Podcast. Please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and smash that like button on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Let us know what you'd like to hear about on the upcoming shows. Again, I'm Pete, and I can be reached at pete@lakeforestpodcast.com. The link will be in the podcast notes below. And on behalf of my history co-host, Arthur Miller, we thank you for listening to the show. Cue the band.